everyone. I'll say the hello again. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another session of the Jurisdictional Action Network webinar. My name is Leonie Aurora. I'm the Landscape and Partnerships Lead for the Tropical Forest Alliance, who manages the Jurisdictional Action Network. We thank you for joining us in this webinar, which we are supporting our close partner, the ISEAL Alliance, to talk about how companies can make claims around their actions at landscape scale. Before we start, and as we are waiting for more participants to come in, just a little bit of housekeeping. We welcome your questions in the Q&A box later, but we would try to limit the questions around the joint position papers that this webinar is based on, around what constitutes as company landscape action, and also about how company can make claims for their landscape scale actions, and also about the landscape reporting framework that the CGI Forest Positive Version of Action has developed. More on that later, but you can share your questions in the Q&A box. And if you have any problems, technical problems, please email Jack Lloyd. You see his email in the on screen. And just to remind you that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording of the webinar to you and to all of the our colleagues in the Jurisdictional Action Network, and also in our repository of resources, the JA Resource Fund. So I will just introduce the speakers and the moderator for this webinar. We are joined by Patrick Mallet, Director for Innovations at ISEAL Alliance, who is our partner in developing and in shaping this webinar. Patrick will talk about the joint position papers that ISEAL has developed in collaboration with various organizations that have been working on landscape and jurisdictional approaches. We also will hear from Norma Pedrosa, the Technical Manager for Forest and Land Sustainable Landscape at CDP, and also we will hear some numbers from company submissions to CDP related to their landscape action. And then Patrick has kindly agreed to moderate a panel with Emily Kunin, Senior Director at PepsiCo, but also co-chair of the CGI Forest Positive Version of Action. Emily will start the panel by presenting the landscape reporting framework that the CGI Forest Positive Version of Action has developed. And the panel, we also have Simon Hall, Senior Manager for Sustainability, Forest and Nature at Walmart, and Jonathan Maker from Earthworm Foundation, who is working a lot with a lot of companies around landscape initiatives. So before I pass over to Patrick, just to remind you again, if you have questions related to the joint position papers and the landscape progress framework, please do put them on the Q&A, and we will try to answer them in the box. Patrick, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Leonie, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm just going to give you a couple of slides. As Leonie mentioned, there's two position papers that we're going to be talking about and around today. And within ISEAL's broader scope of work, for those of you who aren't familiar with ISEAL, it is a membership organization for many of the leading sustainability systems worldwide. And what we try to do is bring those stakeholders together to align around good practices for sustainability action. And that's really what we've been doing in the landscape space over the last couple of years, probably 4 years now, actually, working with colleagues who are thinking about and implementing and testing landscape and jurisdictional approaches to understand how to do that most effectively, and particularly looking at claims and monitoring. And so you can see on this slide the wide range of initiatives that are part of this collaborative effort to come up with aligned positions on company landscape actions and claims. And so these positions that we'll talk about are very much about establishing a common baseline. So many of the initiatives are working more deeply with partners in landscapes to build out stronger and more detailed guidance and practice. And these are kind of foundational pieces. And there are 4 of these position papers. We're going to be talking about the first 2 today. The second 2 are still in development. So the first one, and this, as Leonie mentioned, it's about what constitutes a landscape action. So what's the difference between just a company investment in a project and landscape action? And then how do companies talk about that? What does an effective claim about landscape actions look like? And the 2 positions that we'll conclude later in the year and bring back to you as a community are around the expectations for contributing to performance monitoring. And then most importantly, how do we transition from talking about the actions that we're taking to that contribution of those actions to landscape performance? Go to the next slide. What you'll see here is the first position paper. And the nice thing about these is they're short. They're very digestible. This one about company landscape investments or actions, it sets a very baseline, fairly self-evident set of criteria. So there are prerequisites, just 2 of them, and then additional criteria that are nice to have. But these 2 prerequisites, essentially what counts as a landscape investment or action, is that the action needs to address critical sustainability issues that have been agreed by stakeholders in the landscape or that contribute to those agreed landscape goals. And the second one is that they have to have impacts beyond your individual supply chain. So that's really it. It's just those 2 things. Within that first issue, there are some sub-points. The goals should be defined with local multi-stakeholder input. Companies can demonstrate how the investment or action is going to contribute to the agreed goals. So what does the results chain look like? What's the connection between the action and the outcomes? And that progress towards those goals is monitored and reported so that even you as a company, if you're investing, can understand the extent to which those actions are actually delivering or moving towards the intended goals. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see those contributing factors. Just wait for that slide. Oh, maybe yes, there we are, additional criteria. So the additional criteria are essentially things that will strengthen the effectiveness or impact of those investments or actions. So they are important from that perspective. They're not prerequisites, but they certainly are recommended. And so recognizing that within a landscape, coordinated action is critical. And so how can we ensure that we're also supporting not just the action on the ground, but the multi-stakeholder landscape coordination process, whatever that looks like in the specific landscape? How can we ensure coordination between different stakeholders? And one of the ways to do that is through collective action plans. So how can we ensure that the activities are embedded in those collective action plans so that they're complementary and aligned with other things that are going on in a landscape or jurisdiction? And then finally, also recognizing that it's not just about the actions themselves, but the environment or context in which those actions are happening. So how can we create the enabling conditions, look at the other factors that are influencing the effectiveness or impact that those actions are going to have? So those are just other things to keep in mind. And that's it for position 1. Really is very simple and straightforward. And as Leonie mentioned at the outset, my colleague Norma from CDP is now going to talk a little bit about what they're experiencing in terms of how companies are reporting on the actions and what some of those actions look like. So Norma, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you, Leonie, also for the invite. Hello, everybody. Next slide, please. So as you know, annually, thousands of companies voluntarily disclose to CDP their actions related to climate, water, and forest. And the data we request companies to disclose is based on the best practices, standards, policies, and available science on nature-related topics. Therefore, since 2020, the topic of landscapes and jurisdictional approaches was added as a key new component of CDP's forest questionnaire. And since then, we've been closely working with key organizations such as ISEAL, TFA, ProForest, among others, to make sure our framework is robust and reflecting these best guidances, right? Such as the position papers that Patrick presented, and that will be further discussed in the panel. So in 2020, 27 companies disclosed that they were engaging or investing in a landscape or jurisdictional initiative, 47 in 2021, and 192 companies disclosed this type of engagements in 2022. And this is a huge increase of around 300% from 2021 engagement disclosure. And this represents also 20% of the total number of companies that are forest disclosures to CDP. According to the collected data, it is expected that around 300 companies will be engaging in landscapes or jurisdictional approaches this year, 2023, and in 2024. So clearly, the amount of number of companies engaging in landscapes and jurisdictional approaches is increasing and might be also increasing considerable in the next years. But what about the quality of these engagements? Next, please. Well, in order to determine the credibility of these engagements, we developed a very simple quality disclosure assessment where basically we analyze the reported data and cross-check the degree to which what we call the 3 M's were addressed. The first M looks for information that confirms that landscape initiatives that companies are disclosing consider multiple and collective goals and actions on nature-related topics. Of course, this includes conservation, restoration, sustainable production on commodities, and human well-being. The second M seeks to guarantee that multiple stakeholders participate and take part of the decision-making processes and platforms in the landscape initiatives. And lastly, the third M is about monitoring and transparent reporting systems on actions and progress being made. So, so far the confidence of the disclosure is relatively low, being that in 2022, only 48% of the initiatives disclosed met the 3 M's in a high, confident, or partially good way. So now I'll be presenting you what were the company actions disclosed in 2022 only from those 48% credible landscape initiatives. Next, please. Okay, so the majority of the category actions taken by companies fall into enabling factors, such as participate in planning and multi-stakeholder alignment, enhance governmental or the collaboration with the public sector, and build community and multi-stakeholder capacities. After these enabling factors comes the linking the supply chain actions and collective action with private sector, and the least common category was to support innovative financial mechanisms. Next, please. So here are the top 15 corporate disclosed actions. You can further read through, but the first one being investing on multi-stakeholder or the governance platforms, then co-designing and develop goals and actions plans for the initiative, actions and investments on landscape restoration and protection, land use change monitoring, and improving on agricultural practices and technologies. Of course, the type of actions and investments varies depending on the company, on the landscape, and on the commodity. If you want to know more information about actions, particularities, or recommendations on landscape initiatives per commodities, I recommend you to take a look at the Jurisdictional Approaches Hub website, where together with TFA and ProForest, we've put together some papers in this regard for cocoa and pulp and paper and packaging. And in July, the palm oil paper will come. And also we'll have the beef and soy papers coming in the second half of the year. And yeah, well, this is pretty much it. If there are any comments or questions, you can contact me or any CDP. We'll be happy to support you in this year's disclosure cycle and to collaborate, to collect and use this data.
Great.
Thank
you so much, Norma. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And I think especially to recognize that that second action in particular, the co-designing of the action plans is actually quite a positive thing that the companies really are taking the effort to ensure coordinated action in the landscapes where they're investing. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Patrick.
Great. We'll go to the next slide now. So just a few slides on the second position paper. And this one, again, is about effective company claims about landscape investments and actions. And really, it's about recognizing that having put the time and funding into actions on the ground, there's sometimes often a time lag between those actions and the desired outcomes. And in that time, it's important that companies are able to say something about what's happening on the ground. It's not yet possible to talk about the outcomes, but it is possible to talk about the intended outcomes as well as the actions that are being undertaken. So it's almost like a stepping stone to those performance outcomes. And there are, as I said, a number of frameworks, one of which the CGF Forest Positive Coalition's Landscape Reporting Framework, we're going to hear more about just after this presentation. But with those frameworks, this again kind of sets the baseline expectations. And so something like Landscale, many of you may have heard of, is another initiative that has extensive guidance on these types of requirements. And really fundamentally, just to highlight the role of transparency, this is about the extent to which companies are able to make information available about those actions in a way that allows stakeholders to understand what's happening and to be able to interrogate those actions themselves. So really, it's about transparency as a cornerstone of effective company action that builds stakeholder trust. So let's go to the next slide. Again, with this position, there's two levels of information. The first is, what are the minimum types of information that should be included in a landscape action claim? And then the second piece is things to keep in mind. And it gets a little bit more detailed here, but essentially these are all just fairly obvious components of a claim, the type of information that people would want to know that puts your action in context. So obviously a description of the type of landscape action and which sustainability outcomes the action is contributing towards, the scale and duration. So, when is it taking place, over what period of time? Is it financial or in kind? Where is it taking place, the geographic area? The timing and duration of the action. Sorry, there is a distinction there between the scale of the action or investment and the timing of the individual action itself. And then if there are partners, the name of the landscape initiative or the local multi-stakeholder process, just to know how this fits into other actions in the landscape and the partners through whom the action is being implemented. So let's look at the next slide. We get an example of what this might look like in practice. So I'll just read it through. You can read it yourself. We're contributing 1x dollars or euros, whatever you're comfortable with, over 5 years to support restoration efforts in this landscape with these implementing partners. Our goal is to support this landscape initiative to achieve its vision of 1 million hectares under restoration by 2040. And since March of last year, we've been investing in these types of activities that aim to bring 50,000 hectares under restoration by 2027. So it's a lot of different details in there. Your claims might not look exactly like this, but these are just the types of things that will help stakeholders to understand better the action that's being taken, but also how it fits into this larger context of where and in collaboration with whom for what ends. And so let's go to the last slide. This is looking at some of the supporting information. So in addition to the claim itself, it's nice to have some supporting background information publicly accessible. And so the types of things that we're looking for is information about how the action contributes to the sustainability outcomes. So you remember in the first position, we talked about making that logical connection between action and outcomes. This is about making information about that public. What is the relative contribution? This is an important one. It's quite subjective, but it's kind of the scale question. So to what extent are the actions able to deliver the sustainability outcomes or the broader commitments or targets of the company? And how do they compare with other actions in the landscape? Is this a particularly small or large contribution? What's the relative size? And how does it complement those other actions? So not only is it about achieving those sustainability outcomes, but to what extent is it building on existing work in the landscape? And is that work focused on remediating previous negative impacts? So that's just nice to make that clear. One of the things that we're looking for, and one of the real values of landscape and jurisdictional approaches, is that we can embed these actions. So they're not just one-off projects when the funding ends, the activity ends, and we all go back to the way it was, but rather, how can we embed these results with local stakeholders and in the landscape through some of this coordinated action? And that's the durability piece. Transparency is more in this case about the progress that we're making on the ground. Yes, it's nice to invest, but what's the actual action that's happened? And as the monitoring of progress goes forward, let's make that information available. And this, I think, is a substantive one that we should really highlight, the importance of companies being able to share the data that they have about monitoring progress of their actions in the landscape so that it forms part of that collective picture of what's happening overall. And then importantly, and lastly, the safeguards, we recognize that there's a lot of interconnectedness between actions and enabling conditions in a landscape. Are there any adverse impacts of the investments or actions? And how are they being assessed and mitigated or avoided? So all of those pieces, again, nice things to think about, important to at least work through internally. And to the extent that you can make that information publicly accessible, I think it strengthens not only the claims, but also the transparency and the collaborative nature of the work in the landscape. So that's all from me on the presentation side of things. I'd like to now pass it over to Emily to talk a little bit about the CGF's landscape reporting framework. Emily, over to you.
Sure, thanks, Patrick, and thanks everyone for having me here. I'll just share a bit about this CGF Forest Positive Coalition of Actions work. So as mentioned at the beginning, I'm with the PepsiCo Sustainable Agriculture team, but I also co-chair this coalition. And so I think we can go to the next slide. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Forest Positive Coalition is a CEO-led initiative, and it's made up of 21 member companies of the Consumer Goods Forum, which includes consumer goods manufacturers like PepsiCo, as well as retailers like Walmart, where Simon's from. This coalition was launched back in 2020, and it's really focused on mobilizing the member companies to move beyond just working in our own supply chains, also to build multi-stakeholder partnerships and engagements to both remove deforestation, forest degradation, and conversion from key commodity supply chains and landscapes, but also to strengthen resilience of communities and ecosystems in those landscapes to have really those forest positive outcomes. So we can go to the next slide. So with this coalition, the theory of change of the coalition really requires action beyond individual supply chains. And I think as probably most people on this webinar are familiar with, the past experience from companies working in our own supply chains has really shown that while working directly in our supply chains can make significant progress, focusing solely there is not enough to drive that sector-wide transformation that we really need to end commodity-linked deforestation and to address those drivers of deforestation, because the drivers are rarely connected to just one commodity or one company or one stakeholder group, but really require that collective multi-stakeholder action. So you can imagine one of the key focus areas of this forest positive coalition of action is advancing the adoption of landscape approaches within the consumer goods industry to encourage more widespread global change. Early on, the coalition members were asked to work together to support landscape initiatives, and you can see from the map on the screen here that there's now 23 landscape initiatives that are in the portfolio. And this first group of landscape initiatives for the coalition is not just a way for us to really focus on driving real impact on the ground, but it's also serving as an opportunity for coalition members to learn more about how company investment can support forest positive outcomes in landscapes. So we can go to the next slide. One of the areas of learning in this learning journey has been around the need for a common reporting framework that enables the companies in the coalition and beyond to communicate the action that we're taking, to understand what our impacts are, to enable different stakeholders to more effectively collaborate through landscape approaches towards either common or complementary goals. And so you can see on this slide an overview of the landscape reporting framework that's been developed, and you can see a lot of alignment with what Patrick was describing in their guidance. One of the key things that you'll notice here is that it's taking a phased approach with a combination of narrative reporting to provide initiative-specific context in the early phases, and then core activity metrics in the later phases. I think there was a good explanation already of why one might want to take a phased approach, but essentially for us, there's recognition that landscape level outcomes can take many years to realize. And so this framework focuses on monitoring and reporting actions over all of the phases to demonstrate how progress is taking place towards those ultimate goals. Often we have multiple companies supporting the same landscape initiative. So this is useful because agreeing on common metrics to monitor activities reduces the duplication of efforts. It allows us to better benchmark initiatives progress against one another, and also supports consistent communication by all of the companies involved about the support for landscape initiatives. So really facilitates more effective and more efficient collaboration and allows us to really focus on impact. I'll note that we've been hearing from the member companies in the coalition that this is also really useful, particularly this phased approach, because it allows them to build the case for continued company investment in landscapes in the time before outcomes are realized. So if we go to the next slide, I'll keep this quick, but just wanted to highlight as well where we are now. And so I'll say that this really is still a work in progress, and we're still learning. Earlier this year, 18 of the landscape initiatives in our portfolio used this landscape reporting framework to report on the activities from 2022, with emphasis on the 3 shared impact pillars that you see on the screen. So we're now taking those results, and those are being analyzed. Based on the analysis and the feedback, the framework will be revised. And then also we're looking at a key next step of hosting this portfolio of landscape initiatives on a public platform to enable more transparent reporting of activities and outcomes, and to better communicate how this group of companies is supporting these actions. So I'll leave it there, but happy to discuss further in the Q&A. Thanks, Patrick.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. And really appreciate you being able to share that. We are going to pull it into a panel discussion now. And so Emily will be joined by Simon Hall and Jonathan Merker. And we have some time for this. And I want to just draw us into a more open conversation, just looking at some of the implications of this work and what it looks like in practice. And Emily, just actually to start with you, reflecting on that presentation, there's a lot of work that's going into this landscape reporting framework. I'm wondering, for the CGF companies as a whole, how does this landscape action and investment fit with your broader efforts to strengthen sustainability of supply chains? Is a lot of focus going into the landscapes work, or is this a side piece where most of the effort is supply chain action?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. So I think we're seeing this becoming more and more mainstream as part of companies' overall sustainable sourcing strategies. Of course, different companies are in different phases in their journey. I think as an industry, we've been working on sustainable sourcing in our own value chains for many years, more than a decade, and this has included things like supply chain mapping, farm level assessments, getting certifications, working directly with farmers, and doing capacity building. And as I was mentioning before, a really key learning is that we really can't address the sustainability challenges that are manifesting in our supply chains by exclusively working with our supply chains. And so that multi-stakeholder collaboration with other companies, other industries, government, civil society is recognized as really critical, especially in those very complex challenges where the root causes are much more complicated than any one actor can address. So areas like deforestation in particular, human rights, livelihoods. So I think we're seeing kind of the logic becoming very clear about why landscape initiatives are a critical and complementary component of a supply chain sustainability strategy. But then the kind of practical dimensions are where we are now. So things like having common monitoring and reporting frameworks, or how do you talk about kind of what was achieved with your investment, or attribute the impacts from these types of actions. It's just much more complex than traditional supply chain actions. So that's where we are.
Yeah, and I think that's it's nice to see that complementarity between the supply chain actions and the landscape actions, and figuring out how to do this without it being so complicated as to not be able to drive the actual impacts on the ground, I think is still one of the challenges that we're figuring out. Simon, I want to bring you in on a similar question, just thinking about from Walmart's perspective, this question of motivation, I think, is an important one to start with. Why is Walmart considering landscapes as part of your supply chain investment strategy?
Yeah, it's a great question, and yeah, appreciate the invitation to join this discussion. Thank you. There's a lot to unpack there, but I think in the simplest response I can provide is resilience. I think that is like we constantly come back to that, the principle and concepts of resilience, and we think about resilience for supply chains, for business, for surety of supply, for being able to deliver products to people. Think about resilience for nature, for biodiversity, for ecosystem services on which all of the agriculture, food, fiber sort of products depend. We think about resilience also from a people sort of perspective and communities, as well as climate. So like all of those things are intertwined, and I think landscape and jurisdictional approaches aren't the only way that some of those things show up, but we see it as a really promising opportunity to bring together both the sustainable production of commodities, agriculture, seafood, all of those things that are critically important. And that's very much farm level. We think about certification, we think about verification, we think about engaging individual farmers and ranchers and producers, and how we actually improve sustainable production practices on working lands. Super important, as Emily mentioned, has been, sort of the bread and butter of a lot of sustainability work for many years. But from Walmart's perspective, we put out a very bold, very ambitious goal to become a regenerative company. So how do we go beyond sustaining production? And for us, that brings in conservation and it brings in restoration. And we see landscape approaches as a really promising opportunity to bring together sustainable management alongside conservation restoration with that sort of multi-stakeholder engagement that sort of underpins all of that and brings that sort of stickiness and durability to these interventions, and layer in with the reporting. And then we start to get sort of this very promising mix of ingredients that hopefully can generate the impacts and results that we're hoping for.
And is it the same kind of context as Emily was presenting, where there's the core work within supply chains to ensure the sustainability of inputs, and then seeing the landscape work as a complement to that, or is landscapes almost the primary vehicle?
I think they're very much complementary. We sort of have several very important, very ambitious goals that we've set out, public commitments. So we think about like 20 by 25 sort of sustainable commodities. I think about our forest policy and trying to address deforestation and conversion in key supply chains. And I think about our nature goal. And that really centers around sustainable management, protection, restoration, and it's 50 million acres of land, 1 million square miles of ocean. So when I think about how we're going to deliver on some of those, I think it is complementary, but when I particularly on the nature goal piece, where all three of those elements are coming together, I think landscape approaches, jurisdictional place-based approaches, all of these types of interventions are super important and do play sort of a central role in that. But there are other sort of activities and actions and pools of spatial areas that we will sort of contribute into that. For example, Acres for America is a huge program that we've had, which is another way that we're contributing in primarily conservation acres towards that goal. So it's sort of a myriad of efforts, but I definitely see them as complementary, and landscape approaches playing a really key role.
Excellent. Thanks, Simon. Jonathan, as Leonie mentioned at the outset, Earthworm works in a whole range of different landscapes. Can you speak a little bit first just to what you're seeing in terms of company interest and engagement in these landscape programs? So is this something that's ramping up like we saw in Norma's slides, or what's the level of engagement?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there is more and more recognition that landscape projects are part of the solution, that you can only go so far with a supply chain approach or an industry level approach. You need to work together in these key sourcing regions with other industries, with other stakeholders against a common vision. You know, us having had a landscape program for a number of years, we've clearly seen how the interest and the knowledge around the landscape approach is growing. So I think, I think we're getting to a space where I hope it's becoming like an intrinsic part of sustainable sourcing and the transformation that we all want to see.
And that knowledge and understanding, as Emily mentioned, it's a work in progress to figure this stuff out. How would you say we're doing in terms of, is this about this is a bit of a leading question, but a cookie cutter approach that we can apply in different landscapes, or is each landscape, is it different, and what are we needing to see to have in place in order for those landscapes to succeed? So, you know, is this about inventing the wheel each time we move to a new landscape, or is there some consistency in approach?
No, I do think it's there's no secret recipe you can apply everywhere. I do think that every landscape is different. You have to apply to the context, but there are certain basic principles I do think that need to be applied. You know, the fact that you need to work with a multi-stakeholder approach. You need to work in a multi-commodity fashion if there are several commodities in the landscape. You need to recognize the needs of local communities, farmers, as a key to be able to drive change and to work together. You need to involve government, I think is a critical one as well. So I think there are a few key principles you can distill out of it, but I do think we need to recognize, that each place will have variation based on the context.
One of the things we want to do here is recognize the business case for investing in landscapes and jurisdictions. And Emily and Simon, you both talked to that, whether that's about resilience or about broader impacts. And I'm wondering if there is a strong business case. And I'll put this one to Emily, to you first. Is this the type of thing that it's easy to understand or to justify these types of investments? Or is this work something that still we need to strengthen the business case? And maybe if you have any other thoughts about what are the motivations or the justifications for investing in landscapes, that would be useful as well.
Yeah, so we're hearing the business case, and this is a question we've been asking different companies as part of CGF, but we're hearing the business case really articulated in different ways by different companies. So it can be about securing long-term sustainable supply of ingredients, enabling more resilient value chains, about contributing to companies' climate goals, or ensuring companies meet and maintain their no deforestation and no conversion commitments, about sustainable livelihoods, about addressing leakage market, about more effective ways to engage government. So you see it like there's many different kind of business cases forming. And I think to some extent, it will vary kind of company to company. I think that the key challenge in maybe taking this mainstream as like easily understood as a certification or something like that is in making the business case is addressing the time frames. So most of what I just described as the potential business case has kind of longer term time frames. So demonstrating that you hit your 2030 or 2040 or 2050 climate goals, for example, versus what we're maybe more used to talking about in the corporate world. And so I think that's another maybe example of where this type of phased approach of the claims framework is trying to solve for a bit, but also interested in what Simon would say on that.
Yeah, so Simon, let's hear from you on that one, and then we'll shift the conversation a bit towards the claims side of this work.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that I agree with basically everything Emily said. I think that one of the most promising things about landscape approaches is that they're so multifaceted and there's multiple entry points for companies depending upon what your angle of approach is, whether it's sort of addressing risk on deforestation. There's a lot of landscape approaches that are well positioned to set up and deliver on that. If it's about community, if it's about nature goals, like that's the thing where I think these landscape approaches and the way that they're being designed and how, for implementing partners that we have Earthworm on and folks doing really great work on the ground are being really thoughtful about how to approach these in the right way. And it's very, this is really where you sort of get the art and the science blending together, because we sort of have, from a corporate perspective, we'll come in with the top-down sort of vision of what are the things that we're trying to solve for, but the guidance that you put out is very clear. That needs to sort of come from, there needs to be a bottom-up recognition and identification of what those priorities are. And so there's sort of this marrying of top-down and bottom-up approaches. And that is probably the secret sauce in some of these things, because it brings in that, hopefully, the durability of these interventions over the long term. And that's where I think we've seen in development work over the years or other types of interventions where they just don't stick or they don't last 1-2 election cycles for that local jurisdiction. And I think that's I would sort of add that into some of the points that we've already made around like the why this is interesting and relevant. It's an evolution, I'd say, of approaches that have been tried and tested over time, recognizing where we have some shortcomings and opportunities and trying to sort of be really mindful about how we sort of solve for those. And that's why we're very, I think we're very bullish on these sort of opportunities. And I think they're still a lot to sort of, be seen and tested, and we'll sort of, get into claims and sort of really unpack the details of things probably next year. But yeah, I think there's a lot of whys, and the landscape approaches provide an opportunity for a lot of those things to show up in different ways.
Well, and so thinking about how do businesses justify this investment and engagement, recognizing that claims are a central piece of that, being able to talk about what you're doing, and obviously with those common policy positions, we laid out some basic elements of credible claims. But I want to hear practically from Emily and Simon, and then Jonathan, I'll bring you in again on the claims themselves. Maybe Simon, to you first. Is Walmart already making claims about the investments or actions in landscapes? And if so, what does that look like in practice? Or is that still something that's being figured out?
It's a great question. I think so it's kind of a combination, to be completely honest. I think we're trying to be as transparent as we can and trying to follow and to integrate sort of the emerging guidance that is coming out, like through ISEAL and a lot of the resources on TFA. So there's sort of this need to be transparent in the moment and to be clear to investors and associates and customers and other stakeholders on, like, what are we doing? Why are we doing it? And why this isn't just, and our CEO, Doug, always sort of is, I think, spot on. These aren't sort of extracurricular things. These are core to what we're doing. There's an intrinsic business value to doing these things and making that really clear. And so for example, we recently just published our ESG report on natural resources, and sort of the E there, and covers forests, agriculture, land, oceans. And there's a ton in there. I'd encourage folks to check that out. It's a great resource to sort of see sort of the progress that we're making. A lot of what we're doing, because we're sort of pulling as a retailer, for Walmart, pulling from all of the good work that suppliers are doing. So a lot of the reporting to date is sort of like the roll up, and what's that top line, sort of like whether it's towards our nature goal or towards specific goals on commodities. And there's different sort of actions and interventions that feed up into that. So I'd say it's sort of, I'd sort of close how I started. There's like this, we're trying to be transparent and be clear on what we're doing, but there's also sort of a work in progress to sort of better integrate some of the guidance that's coming out. How do we add that clarity, balancing, we need to be really robust and clear and credible, but we also need to make it easy so that, there's not this super high bar to get suppliers engaged to sort of start moving and sort of continue on that positive direction of travel. So it's a little bit of both in where we currently find ourselves.
Yeah. Emily, is that the same for you? Or if you want to speak to some of the CGF companies, to what extent are claims already being made? And maybe one additional facet to bring in is there a distinction between the way that we talk about landscape actions and other types of impact claims that companies want to make?
Yeah, so I think today, kind of Simon described it, probably a typical situation for companies, and like at PepsiCo, we're trying to be as transparent as possible about what we're supporting. So on our kind of annual reports and website, we have information, mostly in narrative form, about the landscape initiatives that we're supporting. I think most of this guidance that we're talking about right now is quite new. So there hasn't been a way to really aggregate information across landscapes at this point, or talk about kind of how that fits in relation to other types of interventions that we're doing. But I think that feels like the direction of travel at the moment. It's all still really a work in progress. So I think there's a lot more to come.
Yeah, thanks. Jonathan, from your perspective, working with companies, I don't know the extent to which you see the claims side of things. Do you have conversations with companies about how they can talk about the work that's happening on the ground? Are they asking for specific types of information, or what's the reality on the ground there?
Yeah, we do get questions more and more, I'd say, which is a positive thing. But we do see companies wanting, to make claims or communications about their engagement or their investments in these landscape projects. we do see an uncertainty about how to talk about it. And I think that's where the need of clear and simple guidelines is important to help companies be able to do this in a what do you call it, a robust way that these position papers hopefully can help. I do also think there's a bit of the language there's also a bit of a confusion, I think, around the way companies are reporting a lot of their progress. It's, individual KPIs and reporting standards, and the landscapes are often collective in nature. And I so think that language of the corporate way of reporting and the language of the landscape projects, they don't really speak to each other fully yet. So I think that's also talk a bit about the challenges, some of the things we see we need to work on.
Yeah, and that alludes to one of the key challenges that we're all trying to figure out collectively right now is what is the ability of companies to, when we start to talk about those performance outcomes, it's easy enough to talk about the actions that are happening on the ground. If those actions are collective, if there's a number of companies investing in those actions, do they each get to claim the entirety of the action? And then when we start talking about performance outcomes, similarly, how do we recognize the value that each company provides to the end result? And the relationship there, I think, is a tricky one that, again, we're trying to parse out in the next position paper. So still a challenge that's on the floor. Emily, coming back to you, one of the things I want to just focus in on is what the most important aspect of a claim is. So if you think about when you're communicating about actions, and probably whether these are supply chain actions or landscape actions, is there anything specific to landscape actions that is critical to communicate? What are the most important pieces that you'd want to, or your PepsiCo would want to include in communications about landscape actions?
Yeah, so I think if we're thinking about kind of what are some key characteristics of what would be a credible claim or what we want to communicate, I think first it's to be able to really articulate and substantiate both the progress and outcomes in a really honest and transparent way. So I think companies in general are quite conscious of not wanting to misrepresent our role in things, not wanting to greenwash. Like we're, I think, seeing the industry be very conservative on this type of communication. And so I think that, yeah, transparency, talking about really progress, challenges, et cetera. I think another aspect is that because of kind of the collective nature of this work, what you guys were just referring to is having kind of the claims be able to be utilized by multiple companies, and not just companies, but all of the different stakeholders who are involved in a coordinated way for landscapes. So you were mentioning, do a group of companies all get to make the same claims or split the claims? It's not just companies, right? There's other stakeholders who are involved, and it's really hard to attribute the outcomes to one specific action. And so I think parsing that out is critical. And then lastly, I think is having it really be recognized and understood by external stakeholders, because part of it is about explaining, what we've achieved or what we've done, but also part of it is about kind of bringing stakeholders along in the journey. There's CDP and organizations who are asking about this action now, but there's a lot of others who this is not even on their radar. And so I think there's an aspect of communicating why companies should be doing this and creating a call to action for others to take landscape level action as well. That's an important dimension.
Yeah, and I think the simplicity piece is important to recognize. These are very complex engagements, and somehow we want to be able to communicate clearly and simply the benefits and the results that we're achieving. Simon, same question to you, because I think it's an important one. Is there anything that you would add to what Emily said about the types of things that you want to see in a claim or in communications about landscape action?
I think very similar to the points that Emily raised. I think if I had to like distill this down to like a single word, probably at this point in time, like the most important thing is integrity with the claims. And I think it's a new space. I think Jonathan made the point really well. Like there's sort of a certain muscle that corporates have built over the years about how we report, and landscapes look and feel a little different because of the collective nature. Like the most impactful thing about them is probably arguably one of the most challenging things from a claims perspective. And I know that, you know, a lot of really smart people are grappling with this right now. I think there is sort of this, you know, conservative approach, especially when we look at the climate space and see like all of the, you know, pitfalls associated with like, you know, maybe overstepping in claims or like not having the methodology. There's just so many things. And I think we're facing sort of an environment of increased scrutiny, increased sort of like ask for transparency. And I think it's probably prudent at this moment to sort of be conservative in how we're approaching these things, because at the end of the day, trust and integrity are what's going to underpin a lot of the success in these places. And nobody wants to go out and sort of like claim victory when, you know, that may or may not be appropriate. And so the other things, just to sort of like click down into that for us, like a lot of things, like I mentioned our nature goal, which has very clear spatial area targets. So the spatial area component of the impact for conservation, restoration, sustainable management is super important for us. And I think the other one, and I think there's this sort of, you know, projections versus actuals. There's some interesting sort of dialogue around that. There's also, you know, what the local stakeholders have prioritized in that collective action plan and what we or others are sort of investing and taking action, and how all those things fit together. I think that's another really important aspect. It's not just us swooping in with our vision, like this is actually, these are the priorities that these local communities have put to the top, and here's how our intervention is helping deliver on that. And that sort of stitching all that together, I think is really important as well.
Really great. Thank you both. And Jonathan, we're coming close to the top of the hour, so I'm just, if you have a quick intervention on this, I do want to hear from your perspective also the advice you would give to companies. What are the most important things you would think they need to be thinking about when they're making claims or talking about their investments?
Yeah, I think it's the word that comes to mind. Integrity is already taken. Transparency is really important as well. Be transparent about how you're engaged, how you're funding or the actions you're taking, you know, the size and duration of the funding, all these aspects you mentioned earlier, Patrick. And for me, that's goes a long way to building trust in the claim and then the whole landscape engagement as a whole.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you all. I really appreciate your openness. And I think we've got into a good conversation and highlighted a number of the critical issues here. So I really appreciate your inputs and the conversation as a whole. So thank you. And I'll pass it back to Leonie.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. And on behalf of all of us, we want to thank all of the speakers for sharing your insights. I mean, understandably, there's a lot of uncertainty, but we are happy that all of us are working together in this space to try to untangle the uncertainties, and but also that even as we are untangling it, we're taking more landscape action, because we can't slow down just because there are uncertainties. It is a new way of working, like Simon said, and like all of you said, but it is absolutely essential to ensure that we can create transformation at scale. And we thank all of the participants as well for being in this webinar, and we hope you will join us in the next one. And of course, also that you will let us know if you have any topics that you would like us to talk about in Jurisdictional Action Network webinars. Please do let us know, and we will try to discuss it for the whole network. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a great day ahead, or have the great end of your day.